The media are never dumber than when we report on the minimum wage. Workers got a raise, one paper reported. They'll be shouting, "Ole!" Well, such reports assume that if politicians declare that workers should get a raise, they will. But this ignores the unintended consequence. Minimum wage laws kill off the entry-level jobs most needed by poor people. That's why gas stations no longer employ teenagers to wash your windshield. The employer says at those higher government-mandated wages, I can't give a beginner a chance. These losses are harder to see, but they're widespread. A few companies close because they can't afford the higher wages. Another never expands. Most importantly, some businesses never open. The people who were never hired don't complain because they don't know who to blame. They don't even know that they were harmed. They're the unseen victims. Victims of the preening politicians. But the pals keep passing even higher minimums. Living wage laws, they call them. In Washington, D.C., companies that get government contracts must pay employees at least $11.75 per hour. In Manchester, Connecticut, it's $14. Sounds good to the winners. But if a minimum wage really does help workers, why be so cheap? Why only raise it to $14 or $7.50? That's the new national minimum. Why not $100 an hour? At that level, even the politicians understand that workers would be hurt. But the principle's the same at all levels. Supply and demand should set wages.
In reference to talking about government's role in a free society, you mentioned some of the market failures, and I think that you may have just passed over one that is of utmost importance, and that is of poverty. And in prefacing my question, I'd like to refer to what President Kennedy said, that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And to say that, well, we are a government of the people, and when there is a large sector of the people who are hurting, perhaps it is the responsibility of this government of the people to help out.
Well,
my question is regarding how free are the poor, how free are the unemployed, and how free are those people who are disadvantaged? Right. And so in reference to that, right, what is government's role?
Sure. First of all, I'm glad to see one vote for the poor. First of all, the government doesn't have any responsibility. People have responsibility. This building doesn't have responsibility. You and I have responsibility. People have responsibility. Second, the question is, how can we as people exercise our responsibility toward our fellow man most effectively? That's the problem. So far as poverty is concerned, there has never in history been a more effective machine for eliminating poverty than the free enterprise system and the free market. The period in the period in which you had the greatest improvement in the lot of the ordinary man was the period of the 19th and early 20th century. Those of us in this room are the heirs of that. We benefited from the way in which our parents and our grandparents were able to come here. And by virtue of the freedom that was offered to them, were able to make a better life for themselves and them and us. But next, if you look at the real problems of poverty and denial of freedom to people in this country, almost every single one of them is a result of government action and would be eliminated if you eliminated the bad government failures. Let me be precise and specific. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate among black teenagers? It's a disgrace and a scandal. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate? First of all, because we give them lousy schooling through governmental schools, which make them unqualified to hold decent jobs. And second of all, we require employers to discriminate against them by not hiring them unless their productivity is enough to justify a minimum wage. The minimum wage rate is the most anti-Negro law in the books. And it's an anti-Negro law because it precisely, having first not enabled the young blacks to have a decent schooling so that they can have productivity, we next deny them the on-the-job training that they might get if you could induce employers by being able to hire them for relatively low wages to give them on-the-job training that would make them qualify for higher payment and higher productivity. In the third place, we have constructed a governmental welfare scheme which has been a machine for producing poor people. We have induced people to come under control of welfare. I'm not blaming the people, don't misunderstand me. It's our fault for constructing so perverse and so ill-shaped a monster as the whole set of welfare programs we have under which we encourage people, families to break up, we encourage people to move from one part of the country and come to another, under which we have, in effect, made many people poor. And yet, when all this is said and done, have I ever been where?
Welfare or poor.
I have, sir. Of course, more so than most of the people in this room. How many of you have worked a 12-hour day and gotten paid 78 cents? But let me go back to but you know that's all irrelevant. Is there one of you who is going to say that you don't want a doctor to treat you for cancer unless he himself has had cancer? I could go down the line. But when all is said and done, while there are people in this country who are worse off than other people, by and large, even the poorest people in this country are relatively well off compared to the conditions in many other countries in the world. What we take as our standard of poverty, is above the average income of all of the people in the Soviet Union, let alone of the people in India or China or in other countries. Now, that doesn't mean we should be satisfied with it. We are a wealthier country and we've been more productive. And we should set higher standards by ourselves. But by the same token, we ought to have a sense of proportion. And we ought to recognize both the source and the problem.
The minimum wage has been destructive of young people, particularly black youngsters, but yet we're criticized, and the people who support a minimum wage, the intellectuals who support it, are shown to be compassionate and caring.
That's right. In fact, the last year in which black unemployment was lower than white unemployment was the year before the first minimum wage law, which, as you well know, was the Davis-Bacon Act.
Oh yes, and for those out there who don't know the Davis-Bacon Act, the Davis-Bacon Act is a law that says that on all federal construction projects, the prevailing wage must be paid, and the prevailing wage is always interpreted, I think illegally by the Labor Department, as being the union wage or higher. And the purpose, actually, Tom, the stated purpose of the Davis-Bacon Act that was written in March 31st in 1931, the stated purpose was to protect white workers, construction workers, from having to compete with lower wage black construction workers.
Oh, absolutely. And very similar things happened in Canada in the 20s when they passed minimum wage laws to keep white workers from having to compete against Japanese workers. And as you also well know, in South Africa earlier in the century.
That's absolutely right. Matter of fact, in South Africa, I wrote a book called South Africa's War Against Capitalism, and I give quotation after quotation of racist unions in South Africa being the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And matter of fact, they call it the
civilized workers.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so they recognized that if they could raise the wage, contractors would hire white workers instead of black workers.
Yeah, the minimum wage law is very similar to a tariff on international trade. That is, the purpose of a tariff is to raise your competitors' prices to the point where you price them out of the market. And that's exactly the same thing with the minimum wage. That you raise the price of low wage labor to the point where people won't hire them, and therefore the higher wage laborers benefit.
That's right. And you mean tell me, there are other examples of this, that is American labor unions and as well intellectuals, they support environmental laws in India, environmental laws in many underdeveloped countries. and why? To raise the cost of doing business with them.
Well, yes, and well, of course, they are non-discriminatory. They want to raise these costs everywhere they possibly can. The real problem is that they don't see these things in terms of trade-offs. They arbitrarily pick something that they call a good thing, and they pay no attention to the cost of that good thing, either in money or in terms of all the other good things that are going to be harmed by putting in whatever they happen to be in favor of.